So I just want to welcome everybody to our monthly live recording of the Talking About Kids podcast that we do in conjunction with the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. Here, representing the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health is B.R. Thompson from a firm, and Vinny Chilani from the children's from the Phoenix. Okay, so the reason that I have trouble with Phoenix Children's Hospital is that I also do a lot with the Children's Museum of Phoenix. And I do both, by the way. I call them, I switch it around. Anyway, this isn't going to end up in the podcast, so you don't have to worry about that. Our guest today, though, is Kimberly Louvin. And she's here. Kimberly is a licensed social worker who does most of her practice is remote counseling sessions, but she practices a relationship first framework. And I know that a lot of you when you're dealing with adolescents in particular, they are consumed sometimes with their relationships. And so we wanted Kim to come on today and to talk a little bit about relationships. And Kim, it's a question that I ask a lot of my podcast guests kind of to get things started, which is, when you became a counselor, why you became one, and why did you decide to really focus on relationships?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to come and just share whatever ends up getting shared today and kind of talk through this relationship that we all kind of have formed through this online space. I think that kind of one of the reasons that I enjoy focusing on relationships, and I would say it didn't feel as much like a choice. It felt like just recognizing that when I started working with people, I wasn't intending to be a counselor. I started just kind of running after school programs. And at the time, I was focused on maybe moving into a leadership role in nonprofits and just realized that like the deeper work of why people don't end up where they intend to is relational work,
Mhm.
whether it be themselves or a conflict with someone else that they don't feel can be resolved, or that there's a power dynamic that isn't allowing it to be resolved. All of that I began to realize is how we interact with ourselves and others, which is the basis of relationship. And realizing that, okay, I need to better understand how to help people navigate these things because they're repeating patterns and they're not getting where they want to get, and they don't see how they could or why they're not. Um, and so I think why I moved into focusing more on counseling and focusing more on the individual therapy aspect of things was because I realized like if we can't see ourselves clearly, and if we can't see what others see, we won't be able to make the changes we want to make and get where we want to get. Um, and isolation is really painful. And so if we
Mm.
don't feel able to have relationships, or we don't see that the relationships we continue to end up in continue to not go well, and that we aren't seeing that in a way that allows us to not repeat that, we won't get anywhere different. And so I realized I was like, oh, I need to go deeper here. So I need to be able to have that one-on-one work with folks, which at the time was like, also that means I need to get a master's degree. So I went back to school, got that degree, and then worked in schools through the pandemic, finishing up my clinical hours. And through that work, working at a high school with teens who went home for an extra week of spring break and came back 2 years later in Oregon, it really solidified that the one-on-one work with young people is the work where we're all in that transitional space of life of who am I going to be, and which of the people in my life or my family will come with me, and which of those people do I want to not have come with me because they don't see me as me. Um, and with that I began to notice the pattern of if people didn't have healthy attachments with the folks that raised them, they were unable to consistently make any sort of healthy attachments with others who wanted to be in their next chapter of life. But that didn't mean that others weren't interested in making connections to them. And so then you'd see the pattern of young people ending up in relationships that they felt trapped in, that weren't healthy for them, and not really seeing a way out. And so through the pandemic, I realized, oh, I really want to help people see these things, break these things, and have access to at least one person as a therapist who can help them see those patterns. in a way that isn't a peer connection. There's
Right.
not the same level of judgment. There's not the same level of fear of losing that person, and just see where that would go. And it's worked out so far.
Mm.
It's definitely the most. It forces you to do a lot of self-reflection. Because if you're going
Right.
to sit with people and talk about their relationships, it has to come from a place of being willing to take your own advice. So yeah.
We know you mentioned repeating patterns, and you also
Mhm.
mentioned if they didn't have healthy attachments. But what do you consider to be the hallmarks of a positive relationship?
Yeah. Um, I think first and foremost, being able to trust that someone will be honest with you, um,
Right.
and honesty in the sense of not just like, oh, does this shirt look fine on me, but honesty in the sense of like, here's my boundaries and here's my limits, and I'm gonna say that maybe not necessarily in those clear of words, but I'm not gonna make my struggles your responsibility, and I'm gonna be able to say like, we're in a relationship, but I'm having a hard time, and so I need some space, or kind of just being willing to be an individual and being willing to see that the other person is also an individual. Because I think within relationships and within attachments, it's very easy to fall into something that I think some people even encourage, where you're in a relationship, whether it be platonic or romantic, you're now one unit, and that's not true. And I think being willing to accept that even in the closest of relationships, we're still individuals and see people as that, and respect that, and not try to decide who someone else should be. Um, and I think another piece of that is being willing to do that ourselves and say like, oh, I see that I'm still an individual, so I need to take responsibility for that. I need to be taking care of myself, be showing up for myself, so that I can also show up for someone else. Um, I I like to use a lot of random food analogies, when
Mhm.
explaining things. And my favorite one for healthy relationships is that like the relationship or our life is a cupcake, and hopefully it's good. Hopefully we enjoy it. Um, and healthy relationships can be the sprinkles, like they add to it, but they don't make it complete. Um, and they're great and they bring joy and they come and go, but like they add to things. They don't make things complete. And so I think thinking of it that way allows it to be seen as something, of course, we all want, but
Mm.
not something that without a relationship we're nothing. Because it's still a cupcake. Hopefully, it's still good.
Mm. Well, when you're describing though the healthy relationships, and you also mentioned some of the things that break relationships apart. In my head, I was thinking, well, these are things that adults struggle with. I know I have
Hmm.
plenty of contemporaries that haven't achieved what you described right there. But are there some obstacles that adolescents in particular seem particularly prone to stumbling on?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that um, I think there's definitely things that they do, and I think a lot of them are really, in some ways, developmentally appropriate if we take a
Mm,
step back and look at it. Like the thing I see the most that a lot of people might blame social media or technology for is the need to be constantly connected. And
mm,
that if somebody sees a message from you and doesn't respond instantly, that it means something specific always. It means that they don't care, or it means something negative, rather than, oh, they opened their phone and then set it down and got distracted and didn't even read your message whatsoever.
right.
And I think I see that a lot with young people who kind of will automatically read into certain cues like that and then form ideas and form stories about the relationship and not know how, or even that it's okay to say, hey, you left me on red. Do you hate me? And not that any of us feel comfortable saying that directly, but that's the question, that often I would sit with people and they would share like, oh, I think my boyfriend is breaking up with me because he read my message last night and it's third period at school and he hasn't even talked to me. It's over, everything is bad, life is doomed. Um, and I think we can hear that and be like, oh, that's dramatic or that's extreme or kind of have some judgment. And then when we look back at this young person is maybe 15 and doesn't have a lot of other people they can count on. And their experience in that moment is that they're fearing that they're losing one person they thought they could count on, and they don't know how to communicate that. Um, I think so. I think the struggle there is not knowing how to navigate not feeling constantly connected in a world that teaches them and kind of pushes them to desire that in some ways. Um, and also just not necessarily knowing how to ask the questions that they have, even to articulate them to
Right.
themselves. So,
But isn't that the just to kind of play devil's advocate here, isn't that
mhm,
the flip side of this phenomenon that in these online relationships, we also impute a lot of information that just isn't there. You know, this
mhm,
is I mean, it's not just that we interpret a potentially negative interaction or feature as, you know, being dire, but we also assume wonderful, amazing things about
mhm,
people that we primarily interact with online, and that
mhm.
we assume and impute an intimacy that's there too. Do you see adolescents doing that as well?
I do, yeah. And I, it was actually more surprising to me than it probably should have to see how deep that was for some people I worked with who didn't have in-person connections that they valued. Just
Mm,
how much I remember sitting with someone who the reason that they came to my office when I was working in a school was that their boyfriend had broken up with them, deleted them off of Snapchat, and just disappeared overnight. And of course, base level, that's heartbreaking. Let's focus on how you're feeling right now. But as we dug in deeper, they had never met the person, they had never had a video call. And so then after listening for a bit, I just acknowledged as like the question I'm gonna ask you will not feel great at first, but like, how do you know that this person is even who you thought they were? Like,
mm,
I'm not judging your choices. I'm not judging your feelings right now. You lost something that you valued. That makes sense to feel bad. But I want to check in and see like how in the future you can know the people that you're talking to are the people you think, so that like you aren't giving power to someone that might not know or might be kind of making a harmful choice or making a choice to kind of see that you're vulnerable and see that you're young and not be honest with you. Like, how can you make
mm.
sure that they're being as honest as you're being? And it was interesting because it took a lot of kind of, I guess, dancing around the topic of maybe this person is not a child as well, to get to the
Mm.
point of like your connection to that person for you was very real, but they weren't. If you never video chatted with them and you never had things beyond text, you don't know if that person was being honest about who they were. And so I think it, um, I got a little sidetracked from the
No,
original
no, no.
question,
Please
but
continue. Yeah.
I think it was interesting to kind of just dive in and explore the way that they were understanding their experience and see that like what they were getting from that connection, even if hypothetically it was five different people using the same online chat and never even the same person, was they felt connection and really honoring and valuing like this is what you got from this, which is a completely reasonable, well-intentioned desire.
Hmm.
And when we're seeking this in relationships, we need to really make sure that the other person is also one real, but also being reciprocally honest. Um, in a, I've never actually coined that phrase until just now, but I think like that piece of things of like if we're being very vulnerable
Right.
and someone else seems like they might be being vulnerable with us, it's it's important to kind of create for yourselves, I think, like how do we make sure this is real? How do we make sure we're not talking to Chat GPT? Um,
Mm.
and then I think with that, like using tools like Chat GPT in a way that can help us gain some objective perspective sometimes. And so maybe
Well,
saying like,
right. I'm gonna reel back a
mhm,
little bit because I don't want
yeah,
to. That's going in a direction that I still have a couple questions about
yeah,
your first point there.
mhm,
And I think that you did in your example, I think you pointed to something that I have to admit I've done poorly, which is when in talking with a young person and when I realize that what they're talking about is in a strictly online relationship, that I have been dismissive, or I haven't given that relationship the proper amount of respect. At least it wasn't commensurate with what that adolescent was feeling. Are there other mistakes that adults make when they are talking with young people about the relationships?
Mhm. Um, Short answer, yes, because I think we all kind of, I think, project our own understanding of how we would do the situation.
Hmm.
And I had to working with young people over the last decade or so, I had to constantly kind of sit in this interesting space of what would it be like if I was 15 and I had this much access to the internet, and how might I do things? And kind of continually ask either myself that question or just kind of put myself in that shoe of if I had the ability to do these things, how might I engage with them?
Hmm.
Before I kind of had I think the knee-jerk judgment of like, "Ah, it's online. Why are you treating this like it's not online?"
Right.
And then I think when COVID happened, I was like, oh, we can't say that to young people anymore. We can't make such a hard distinction between online and in-person relationships when we're expecting them to get an education online only, and they might never meet their teacher in person. And if we're
Right.
expecting them to gain certain things through that relationship, we can't have the same type of judgments of other relationships they form. And I think the mistake that had been made of kind of seeing those as distinctly different or almost tiered or hierarchical comes from not seeing what is that, what is the young person gaining from that connection?
Mhm.
Um, because I think this kind of is similar to some opinions I have on like whether video games and online gaming are helpful or harmful. And I think nothing is ever a binary, but when we think of the ways that people meet their social needs and meet their relational needs, sometimes it's through going and playing a sport in person and seeing those people every Tuesday for practice.
Right.
Online, if someone has a relationship or a friendship of every Tuesday, we play such and such game for 3 hours. For them, they're also gaining that social connection. And so seeing the mistake I think that is easy to make is not seeing that needs can be met in online platforms, um, which then can lead into a conversation of thinking of accessibility and thinking of the ableism that can exist in prioritizing in person over online, and seeing that some people can't access in person relationships. And so I think taking a moment to say, okay, what is this person gaining from this? And
Mhm.
what am I not seeing because of my own bias or my own experience of when I was a teenager, we had to go talk to someone. We had to call them. We had to risk their parent picking up the phone and
Right.
listening into the conversation versus being on our phone in the room. Um, so I think it's mostly rooted in just not being willing to perspective take as much as we could, um, and not
Pierre,
being willing to see the need not
yeah.
being.
Pierre and Vinny, you both work with populations that have sometimes struggled to find peer groups in person in their school communities or in their neighborhoods. So, what's your reaction to what Kim is saying about the pros and cons of these online relationships?
I think what really struck me with what I was talking about is that these relationships oftentimes serve the very same purpose, and it's the relationships that they can access. But as I sit here and listen to what Kimberly is talking about, I really think about how do you translate that one-on-one work, deconstructing thoughts and feelings and behaviors in relationships to scale, because we socialize young people as adults into relationships, and relationships are modeled for young people. Young people only know how to be in relationships in the ways that they know how, in the ways that they've learned how. Have you come across any tools, any resources, anything that you might be able to scale outside of that really important one-on-one work?
Um,
Yeah.
and oh, good.
No, go ahead, Kim. I was going to restate that
Yeah.
question for you. If you, yeah, what you gave in your bio that you talked about the power that you found in those one-on-one sessions that you were having with your clients. but we need to scale some of these skills is
Mhm.
Vinny's points. And how do we do that? Have you found things that we think are scalable that would work for one of our listeners who has a classroom or is in that after school program?
Mhm. Yeah, I don't necessarily have a specific tool off the top of my head,
Mhm.
but I think using the pre-existing set of relationships of if a young person is at school, whether it be in person or online school, there are X number of people that they have to interact with on a regular basis. And choosing to kind of frame those as you have a essentially assigned relationship. These, let's say 30 people in your class and this one or two adults. How can we understand how we interact by looking at this set of relationships that we have right here? And how can we practice certain skills such as conflict resolution or
Mm,
asking questions that you don't know if they're phrased well or that they'll land well in a setting where it's like maybe it's a math class and you could practice you could practice saying I don't know how to do this, I need help, by saying let's practice talking to a peer, and or let's practice sending an email to your teacher asking for help after class and saying the need I have is alone time, it's hard for me to do work around people, can you help me? Because that same skill of communicating your needs, asking for something from someone who's offered it, and being vulnerable and saying I don't know what I'm doing can
mm,
exist in so many settings that young people are already expected to be in. And I think it looking at it from that perspective, I think is maybe less common because we don't think about math class as a bunch of relationships. We think of it as math class, a thing we have to do at whatever time. But I think beginning to see our role as adults as teaching and modeling those relationship skills in every interaction can help us begin to one slow down and see maybe what that young person who is in your class and is just seeming angry, like maybe say, hey, I see that you're angry in math class all the time. What is that about math class? I think is a good first step because I think it demonstrates to that young person, hey, I see that you're in distress as an adult. I care about you enough to ask. And I want to give you a chance to have the table, to have the microphone, to say whatever it is that might be going on. Because it might be something big. It might just be, I hated my lunch today, and so I have a headache. But either way, that young person is able to see that an adult noticed them individually, acknowledged that they wanted to offer some sort of something, and gave them an opportunity to have a voice. And I think so many young people they want to have a voice, but they maybe have experienced being denied that or being told they can't have that in settings that are parent relationships. And so if their math teacher calls out, hey, you seem not fine, what's going on? That might be a much lower stakes place to practice. Hey, maybe don't get defensive and snap back and get mad. Maybe just
mm.
see that I was trying to care for you as your math teacher. Um, and I think just modeling what healthy communication can look like in every chance we get can help in ways that I think will ripple out. Because I don't think young people receive that modeling as often as we might hope they could.
Right.
And so if we can offer it more, I think that's
You know,
helpful.
you used as your advice to the adult to slow down, and that brought to mind this observation. I have no data around this, but I think what I'm seeing is that one of the things that are mediated relationships that are either existing solely in this digital space or at least have this a very significant component of them playing out in the digital space, they seem to progress and cycle faster. Like they
Mhm.
seem to go through every stage of a relationship more quickly, including the end stage, such
Mhm.
that in particular with digital relationships that I've observed, when something goes wrong, there seems to be less of either an impetus or an opportunity to resolve. They just go
Mhm.
away. And so
Mhm.
these young people don't actually work through having to be in the same room with this person over and over again. They're just gone from them.
Mhm.
Do you see this too, where we're losing opportunities to work through problems?
Yeah. I think with that, what I noticed specifically, kind of coming back from online to in-person work in schools post-pandemic, if that's the phase that we're in, was just how as adults we weren't we weren't willing to slow down either, and have those conversations. We weren't willing to acknowledge at the level that we could have that we had all just experienced something. It was painful in different ways for different people, and we aren't just back at school pushing play where we press pause. And so I think I see a couple things. One of them is that as adults, we also don't like to sit with discomfort and grief and pain and acknowledge it. And so we aren't modeling for young people that process as well as we could sometimes. And within the school setting, I would also say that sometimes the ways that the discipline processes go, where something painful happens, we as adults have an opportunity to model for that young person, saying, "Hey, you said this thing to me that hurt my feelings. I want to slow down and figure out what was going on with you, because you're a young person, and I doubt that you wanted to hurt your teacher's feelings. So let's explore that." Instead, we just decide, we as the adult make the choice. The resolution is that you go away. And so I think that is kind of an individual, but also a phenomenon in how many school discipline systems work, teaches young people that resolve process doesn't always get to happen, that there's an authority figure who made a decision and pushed me away, and my feelings will just go with me. And I think what that makes difficult to happen is when a young person has a friendship rupture or a relationship rupture, they don't know what to do other than go away, and just take their feelings somewhere else and go away, because they might not have seen a way to say, "Hey, I'm hurt," or "I'm sorry." And I think as adults, what we can do is apologize to kids more often. And one of the things that I kind of allowed me to be okay not working in schools anymore was realizing that I hoped that schools would take the opportunity to really sit with young people and acknowledge how the last couple years had felt. And so many didn't. And so young people got that message of, "Oh, I'm just supposed to do math. Like I wasn't whatever my experience was." And so I think acknowledging how hard it is for us to do that helps young people know, like, oh, they don't know what they're doing either. So we can kind of try to figure it out, but it's also okay to not know and ask.
Speaking of how difficult it can be to be an adult or to be a young person, Bia, you have a report that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So yesterday we published the first ever report on the status of adolescent health in the state of Arizona. We encourage you all to reach out to us if you're interested in getting a printed or electronic copy of it, but you can visit our website at www.healthyazyouth.org/status report, and you'll get to see that digital copy of it. We really just wanted to give a snapshot of the struggles, the challenges, the wins and successes that adolescents are experiencing here and broadly, right? And we hope that this is the first of many editions.
And if you're listening from outside of Arizona, first of all, the link to it will be in the information on this podcast. But I encourage you also to take a look at the report to see, what your community is doing, and if you can replicate this in the state or community that you're in, and use it even as a comparison, because we know that it's a shrinking world. And if adolescents in Arizona are facing it, there's a really good chance that adolescents in your community are too. We're out of time today, but I just wanted to really thank Kim for sharing those insights. Listeners of Talking About Kids will know how much I appreciate your lens of asking adults to pay attention to themselves and what they're modeling before asking something different of the kids with whom they're working. So I really appreciate that, Kim, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it. And for all of you, we'll hope to see you next month. Be on the lookout for that topic and for a link to join us then. But thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.